Hello, thank you all for coming. I am James Hufford. I'm the founder of 9/11 Truth of Central Iowa, which is a branch of the 9/11 Truth organization, the only such in Iowa. We are hoping that some of you will feel inclined to sign up for our call list for our monthly meetings. We meet sometime in the third week of every month in the public library in Adel, and I have over 100 names on my call list now, and our meetings are normally attended by around 30 people, different 30 each month. You never know who's going to show up, but I'd really love to have some of you, or I guess all of you, would have to find a new place to meet, but love to have you join up. And all you need to do is give me your name and your phone number. If you're not from Des Moines, maybe put your town. That would be interesting. You can give me your email address if you prefer, and then before each of our meetings in the week before, I'll give you a call or an email and inform you when the meeting will be, and very privileged to be able to introduce two-time Nobel Prize nominee I'm still in the last century, 2008 and 2009 Nobel Peace Prize nominee that should win. He should win one of these years, and if he does, it'll be a victory for the whole world when that happens, and we'll all meet to celebrate. But he's the author of over 35 books. He's an eminent theologian, and I think I'm safe in saying that he probably knows more about 9/11 than any other individual on the face of the earth, with the exception of the planners. So, further ado, I'm supposed to tell you that afterwards, of course, there'll be a question and answer session, and you will be asked, if you ask a question, to come down and sign a release form so that you can appear in the DVD, which we hope will be released not too long from now of this event. And if you're interested in getting one of those DVDs, well, you're going to have to pick up our invitation sheet, which tells about our group, and get my phone number and call me, and then we can arrange for you to acquire a DVD. So, well, without further ado, then I give you David Ray Griffin. Dr. Griffin, I want to formally induct you as a member of our informal group, and to do so, I present you with our official shirt of our group.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, James. And many people have asked me, is this my first time to Des Moines? The answer is yes. And the next question is, how do you like it? I'm going to withhold judgment until I get out of town, but so far I like it very, very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and very impressed that so many people have turned out for this non-controversial topic. Now, is this gonna, so is that okay where the microphone is? No? It needs to be up a little bit. There, okay. Does that do it? Yeah. Okay, thank you. So the topic of my lecture is the war in Afghanistan justified by the 9/11 attacks? There are many questions to ask about the war in Afghanistan. One being widely asked is whether it will turn out to be Obama's Vietnam. This question implies another, whether this war is winnable or is destined to be a quagmire like Vietnam. A question motivated by many things, including the widespread agreement that the Afghan government under Hamid Karzai is at least as corrupt and incompetent as the government that the United States tried to prop up in South Vietnam for 20 years. There are many other similarities, but there is also one big difference. This time, there is no draft. If there were a draft, so that college students and their friends back home were being sent to Afghanistan, there would be huge demonstrations against this war on campuses all across the United States and Canada. If the sons and daughters of wealthy and middle-class parents were coming home in boxes or with permanent injuries or with post-traumatic stress syndrome, this war would have probably been stopped long ago. This room would be packed with college students if there were a draft. People have often asked, did we learn any of the lessons of Vietnam? The US government learned one. If you're going to fight an unpopular war, don't have a draft. There are many, many other questions, but in this lecture I will focus on only one. Is the war in Afghanistan justified? This question has two parts. First, is the war legally justified? Second, is it morally justified? As I deal with these questions, try to imagine that there is a draft so that you or your spouse or your friends or your children or grandchildren might be sent to fight in this war. I begin with the question of legal justification. Since the founding of the United Nations in 1945, international law with regard to war has been defined by the UN Charter. Measured by this standard, the US-led war in Afghanistan is illegal. Marjorie Cohn, a well-known professor of international law, wrote in November 2001, "The bombings of Afghanistan by the United States and the United Kingdom are illegal." In 2008, Cohn repeated this argument in an article entitled "Afghanistan, the Other Illegal War." The point of this title was that although it was by then widely accepted that the war in Iraq was illegal, the war in Afghanistan, in spite of the fact that many Americans did not realize it, was equally illegal. Her argument was based on the following facts. First, according to international law, as codified in the UN Charter, disputes are to be brought before the UN Security Council, which alone may authorize the use of force. Without this authorization, any military activity against another country is illegal. Second, there are two exceptions. One is that if your nation has been subjected to an armed attack by another nation, you may respond militarily in self-defense. This condition was not fulfilled by the 9/11 attacks because they were not carried out by another nation. Afghanistan did not attack the United States. Indeed, the 19 men charged with the attacks were not from Afghanistan. The other exception occurs when one nation has certain knowledge that an armed attack by another nation is imminent, too imminent to bring the matter to the Security Council. The need for self-defense must be, in the generally accepted phrase, instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. Although the U.S. government claimed that its military operations in Afghanistan were justified by the need to prevent a second attack, this need, even if real, was not urgent, as shown by the fact that the Pentagon did not launch its invasion until almost a month later. U.S. political leaders have claimed to be sure that the UN did authorize the U.S. to attack Afghanistan. This claim, originally made by the Bush-Cheney administration, was repeated by President Obama in his West Point speech of November 1st, 2009, in which he said, "The United Nations Security Council endorsed the use of all necessary steps to respond to the 9/11 attacks. So U.S. troops went to Afghanistan under the banner of international legitimacy." However, the language of all necessary steps is from UN Security Council Resolution 1368, in which the Council, taking note of its own responsibilities under the Charter, expressed its own readiness to take all necessary steps and to respond to the terrorist attacks of 11 September 2001. Of course, the Security Council might have determined that one of those necessary steps was to authorize the United States to attack Afghanistan, but it did not. Resolution 1373, the only other Security Council resolution about this issue, laid out various responses, but these included matters such as freezing assets, criminalizing the support of terrorists, exchanging police information about terrorists, and prosecuting terrorists. The use of military force was never mentioned. The U.S. war in Afghanistan was not authorized by the UN Security Council in 2001 or at any time since. So this war began as an illegal war, and it is an illegal war today. Our government's claim to the contrary is false. This war is illegal, moreover, not only under international law, but also under U.S. law. The UN Charter is a treaty which was ratified by the United States. And according to Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, any treaty ratified by the United States is part of the supreme law of the land. The war in Afghanistan is therefore in violation of U.S. as well as international law. It could not be more illegal. American public, for the most part, is probably unaware of the illegality of this war, because this is not something that our political leaders or our corporate media have been anxious to point out. So most people simply don't know. If they were informed, however, many Americans would be inclined to argue that, even if technically illegal, the U.S. military effort in Afghanistan has been morally justified by the attacks of 9/11. For a summary statement of this argument, we can turn again to the West Point speech of President Obama, who has taken over the Bush-Cheney rationale for 9/11. Answering the question of why America and our allies were compelled to fight a war in Afghanistan in the first place, Obama said, "We did not ask for this fight. On September 11, 2001, 19 men hijacked 4 airplanes and used them to murder nearly 3,000 people. They struck at our military and economic nerve centers. They took the lives of innocent men, women, and children without regard to their faith or race or station. As we know, these men belong to Al-Qaeda, a group of extremists who have distorted and defiled Islam. After the Taliban refused to turn over Osama bin Laden, we sent our troops into Afghanistan." The standard account can be summarized in terms of 3 points. First, the attacks were carried out by 19 Muslim members of Al-Qaeda. Second, the attacks had been authorized by the founder of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, who was in Afghanistan. Third, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan was necessary because the Taliban, which was in control of Afghanistan, refused to turn bin Laden over to U.S. authorities. On the basis of these 3 points, our political leaders have claimed that the United States has the moral right arising from the universal right of self-defense to attempt to capture or kill bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network to prevent them from launching another attack on our country. The only problem with this argument is that all 3 points are false. I will show this by looking at these points in reverse order. The claim that the Taliban refused to turn over bin Laden has been repeatedly made by political leaders and our mainstream media. Reports from the time, however, show that the truth is very different. 10 days after the 9/11 attacks, CNN reported, the Taliban refused to hand over bin Laden without proof or evidence that he was involved in last week's attacks on the United States. The Taliban ambassador to Pakistan said Friday that deporting him without proof would amount to an insult to Islam. CNN also made clear that the Taliban's demand for proof was not made without reason, saying, bin Laden himself has already denied he had anything to do with the attacks, and Taliban officials repeatedly said he could not have been involved in the attacks. Bush, however, said the demands were not open to negotiation or discussion. With this refusal to provide any evidence of bin Laden's responsibility, the Bush administration made it impossible for the Taliban to turn bin Laden over. As Afghan experts quoted by the Washington Post pointed out, the Taliban, in order to turn over a fellow Muslim to an infidel Western nation, needed a faith-saving formula. Milton Bearden, who had been the CIA station chief in Afghanistan in the 1980s, put it this way: while the United States was demanding, give up bin Laden, the Taliban was saying, do something to help us give him up. But the Bush administration refused. After the bombing began in October, the Taliban tried again, offering to turn bin Laden over to a third country if the United States would stop the bombing and provide evidence of bin Laden's responsibility. But Bush replied, there's no need to discuss innocence or guilt. We know he's guilty. An article in London's Guardian, which reported this development, was entitled, Bush Rejects Taliban Offer to Hand bin Laden Over. So it was the Bush administration, not the Taliban, that was responsible for the fact that bin Laden was not turned over. In August of 2009, President Obama, who had criticized the U.S. invasion of Iraq as a war of choice, said of the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, this is not a war of choice, this is a war of necessity. But the evidence shows, as we have seen, that it, like Iraq, is a war of choice. This conclusion is reinforced by reports indicating that the United States had made the decision to invade Afghanistan 2 months before the 9/11 attacks. The background for this decision was the United States' longtime support for a pipeline project proposed by Unocal, which would transport oil and gas from the Caspian Sea region to the Indian Ocean through Afghanistan and Pakistan, and therefore not through Russian territory. This project had been stymied through the 1990s because of the civil war that had been going on in Afghanistan since the Soviet withdrawal in 1989. In the mid-1990s, the U.S. government had supported the Taliban with the hope that its military strength would enable it to unify the country and therefore protect the pipeline. By the late 1990s, however, the Clinton administration had given up on the Taliban. When the Bush administration came to power, it decided to give the Taliban one last chance. During a 4-day meeting in Berlin in July 2001, representatives of the Bush administration insisted that the Taliban must create a government of national unity by sharing power with factions friendly to the United States. The U.S. representatives reportedly said, either you accept our offer of a carpet of gold, or we will bury you under a carpet of bombs. After the Taliban refused this offer, the Americans reportedly said, military action against Afghanistan would go ahead before the snow started falling in Afghanistan by the middle of October at the latest. And indeed, given the fact that the 9/11 attacks occurred on 9/11, September 11th, the Pentagon was able to mobilize to begin its attack on Afghanistan by October 7. It appears, therefore, the United States invaded Afghanistan for reasons far different from the official rationale, according to which we were there to capture or kill Osama bin Laden. I turn now to the second point, the claim that Osama bin Laden had authorized the attacks. Even if it refused to give the Taliban evidence for this claim, the Bush administration surely, most Americans probably assume, had such evidence and had provided it to those who needed it. Again, however, the reports from the time indicate otherwise. 2 weeks after 9/11, Secretary of State Colin Powell said that he expected in the near future to put out a document that will describe quite clearly the evidence that we have linking bin Laden to this attack. But at a joint press conference the very next day with President Bush, Powell had to withdraw this pledge, saying that most of the evidence is classified. Seymour Hersh, citing officials from both the CIA and the Department of Justice, said the real reason why Powell withdrew the pledge was a lack of solid information. The following week, British Prime Minister Tony Blair issued a document to show that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, the terrorist network which he heads, planned and carried out these atrocities on 11 September 2001. Blair's report, however, began by saying, this document does not purport to provide a prosecutable case against Osama bin Laden in a court of law. So it was good enough to go to war, not good enough to go to court. The next day, the BBC emphasized this weakness, saying, there is no direct evidence in the public domain linking Osama bin Laden to the 11 September attacks. What about our own FBI? Its most wanted terrorist webpage on Osama bin Laden does not list 9/11 as one of the terrorist acts for which he is wanted. Most Americans still do not know this. When asked why not, the FBI's Chief of Investigative Publicity replied, because the FBI has no hard evidence connecting bin Laden to 9/11. What about the 9/11 Commission? Its entire report is based on the assumption that bin Laden was behind the attacks. However, the report's evidence to support this premise has been disowned by the Commission's own co-chairs, Thomas Kean and Lee Hamilton. This evidence consisted of testimony that had reportedly been elicited by the CIA from Al-Qaeda operatives. The most important of these operatives were Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, generally known simply as KSM, who has been called the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. If you read the 9/11 Commission's account of how bin Laden planned the attacks, and then check the notes in the back, you will find that almost every note says the information came from KSM. In 2006, Kean and Hamilton wrote a book giving the inside story of the 9/11 Commission, in which they called this information untrustworthy. They had no success, they reported, in obtaining access to star witnesses in custody, most notably Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Besides not being allowed by the CIA to interview KSM, they were not permitted to observe his interrogation through one-way glass. They were not even allowed to talk to the interrogators. Therefore, Kean and Hamilton complained, we had no way of evaluating the credibility of detainee information. How could we tell if someone such as Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was telling the truth? They could not. Accordingly, neither the Bush administration, the British government, the FBI, nor the 9/11 Commission ever provided reliable evidence of bin Laden's responsibility for the attacks. Some people argue, to be sure, that such evidence is no longer needed because bin Laden admitted his responsibility in a videotape that was discovered in November 2001. But bin Laden had previously denied his involvement many times, and some bin Laden experts call this later video a fake, and for good reasons. Many of the physical features of the man on this video are different from those of Osama bin Laden. And he said many things that Osama bin Laden himself would not have said. I've spelled this out in a little book called Osama bin Laden, Dead or Alive. The FBI, in any case, evidently does not believe that this video provides hard evidence of bin Laden's responsibility for 9/11, or it would have revised its most wanted terrorist page on him to add this fact. So, to review the first 2 points, the Taliban said it would turn over bin Laden if the government had given it good evidence of his responsibility for 9/11, but our government refused, and good evidence of this responsibility has never been given to the public. I turn now to the third claim, that even if there is no proof that Osama bin Laden authorized the attacks, we have abundant evidence that the attacks were carried out by Muslims belonging to his Al-Qaeda organization. This is still widely assumed. The truth, however, is that the evidence in favor of Al-Qaeda hijackers falls apart upon examination. And this suggests that 9/11 was instead a false flag attack, an attack that people within our own government orchestrated while planting evidence to implicate Muslims. Let us begin with the 9/11 Commission's claim that the men who took over the planes were devout Muslims, ready to sacrifice their lives for the cause. The San Francisco Chronicle reported that Atta and other hijackers had made at least 6 trips to Las Vegas, where they had engaged in some decidedly un-Islamic sampling of prohibited pleasures. The Chronicle then quoted the head of the Islamic Foundation of Nevada as saying, "True Muslims don't drink, don't gamble, don't go to strip clubs." The contradiction is especially strong with regard to Muhammad Atta, said to be the ringleader. On the one hand, according to the 9/11 Commission, he was very religious, even fanatically so. This characterization was supported by Professor Dietmar Makuli, who was Atta's thesis supervisor at a technical university in Hamburg, Germany, in the 1990s. Professor Makuli says he knew this student only as Muhammad al-Amir, although his full name was the same as his father's, Muhammad al-Amir Atta. In any case, Makula said that this student was very religious, prayed regularly, and never touched alcohol. According to the American press, on the other hand, Muhammad Atta drank heavily, and one night after downing 5 glasses of vodka, shouted an Arabic word that Newsweek said roughly translates as, and now I need what John Stewart has whenever he says the F word, it gets bleeped. But this is what the Newsweek wrote. They put F-K, God. Investigative reporter Daniel Hopsicker, who wrote a book about Atta, stated that Atta regularly went to strip clubs, hired prostitutes, drank heavily, and even took cocaine. Atta even lived with a stripper for several months, and after she kicked him out, he came back and disemboweled her cat and her kittens and strewed them on her kitchen table. Could this be the same individual as Professor Makuli's student, Muhammad al-Amir, who would not even shake hands with a woman upon being introduced, and who never touched alcohol? "I would put my hand in the fire," said the professor, "that this Muhammad al-Amir I know will never taste or touch alcohol." Could the Atta described by Hopsicker and the American press be the young man whom this professor described as not a bodyguard type, but more a girl-looking type? Could the man who disemboweled kittens be the young man known to his father as a gentle and tender boy who was nicknamed Nightingale? We are clearly talking about 2 different men. This is confirmed by the difference in their appearance. The American Otter was often described as having a hard, cruel face, and the standard FBI photo of him bears this out. The face of the Hamburg student was quite different, as photos available on the internet show. Also, his professor described him as very small, being 1.62 meters in height, which means slightly under 5'4", whereas the American Otter has been described as 5'8" and even 5'10". One final reason to believe that these different descriptions apply to different men. The father of Muhammad al-Amir Otter reported that on September 12th, before either of them had learned about the attacks, his son called him, and they spoke for 2 minutes about this and that. And in case anybody doesn't know, Muhammad Atta was allegedly the pilot of Flight 11, which crashed into the North Tower. His father says he called him the next day. There are also problems in relation to many of the other alleged hijackers. For example, the BBC reported that Walid al-Shiri, who supposedly died along with Atta on American Flight 11, spoke to journalists and American authorities in Casablanca the following week. Moreover, there were clearly 2 men going by the name Ziad Jarrar, the name of the alleged hijacker pilot of United Flight 93. And those are just a few illustrations. Accordingly, besides the fact that the men labeled the hijackers were not devout Muslims, they might not have been Muslims of any type. And if that were not bad enough for the official story, there is no good evidence that these men were even on the planes. All the evidence for this claim falls apart upon examination. I will illustrate this point with a couple of examples. Now, maybe 2 examples won't be enough for you, but when you see about 10 of them, you start to become a believer. And you can get these in my 2008 book, The New Pearl Harbor Revisited. One of the purported proofs that the 19 men identified as the hijackers were on the planes was the reported discovery of some of their passports at crash sites. But the reports of these discoveries are simply not believable. For example, the FBI claimed that while searching the streets after the destruction of the World Trade Center, they discovered the passport of Satam al-Suqami, one of the hijackers on American Flight 11, which had crashed into the North Tower. But for this to be true, the passport would have had to survive the collapse of the North Tower, which pulverized almost everything in the building into fine particles except the dust, into fine particles of dust, except the steel and al-Suqami's passport. But this claim was too absurd to pass the giggle test, and it was modified. By 2004, the claim was that a passerby picked it up and gave it to a New York police detective shortly before the World Trade Center towers collapsed. So, rather than needing to survive the collapse of the North Tower, the passport merely needed to escape from al-Suqami's pocket or his suitcase, then from the plane's cabin, and then from the North Tower without being burned up or even singed by that giant fireball that erupted immediately. This version was no less ridiculous than the first one. And the other stories about passports at crash sites are equally absurd. Actually, the funniest one is about Flight 93. So if in the Q&A you want a funny story, ask about that. It is widely believed, of course, that we know that there were hijackers on the airlines thanks to the numerous phone calls from the passengers and crew members in which they reported the hijackings. But we have good reasons to believe that these calls never occurred. More stuff you've not been told by your corporate media. About 15 of the reported calls from the airliners were said to have been made on cell phones. with about 10 of those being from United Flight 93 alone, the one that allegedly crashed in Pennsylvania. 3 or 4 of those calls were received by Dina Burnett from her husband Tom Burnett. And Dina says she knows he was using his cell phone because she looked at her caller ID, and there's Tom's cell phone number. Proof, right? However, given the technology, cell phone technology available in 2001, high altitude cell phone calls from airliners were not possible. They were generally not possible over 1,000 feet, and certainly not above 35 or even 40,000 feet, where most of the calls were allegedly made. Articles describing the impossibility of the calls were published in 2000 and 2003 and 4 by 2 well-known Canadians, A.K. Dewdney, formerly a columnist for the Scientific American, and well-known economist Michelle Chossudovsky. Perhaps in response to these articles, the FBI changed the story. In 2006, it had to present a report on the phone calls from the airliners for the trial of Zacarias Moussaoui, the so-called 20th hijacker. In its report on United Flight 93, it said that the cell phones were used for only 2 calls, both of which were made after the plane had descended down to 5,000 feet, where at least one might argue that cell phone calls were possible. These 2 calls were, moreover, according to this FBI report, the only 2 cell phone calls from all 4 planes put together. So, the FBI thereby avoided claiming in official report for a court of law that any high-altitude cell phone calls were made. But if the FBI's new account is true, how do we explain that so many people reported receiving cell phone calls from loved ones? Most of these people said that they had been told by the caller that he or she was using a cell phone. So we might suppose, well, they misheard or they misremembered. Although it'd be a little hard to believe that over a dozen people had made the same error. But if you want to believe it, you could maybe do that. But if so, what do you do with Dina Burnett? She saw his cell phone call, his number on her ID. Now the FBI says he called using a seatback phone. How in the world would his cell phone number have gotten on her caller ID? The only answer seems to be these calls were faked. There was the technology at the time to do that. You can morph the voice. This was demonstrated in a 1999 article in the Washington Post using the voice of Colin Powell. Everybody in the room swore it was Colin Powell. And also there are devices to fake the caller ID. So maybe that was it. Or maybe somebody just had taken Tom's cell phone and made these calls to Dina from the ground using voice morphing. But whatever the case is, either of those, Tom Burnett did not call his wife from Flight 93. We have lots of these problems, but let me go right to the other one. The most famous of all the reported calls from the plane were those reported by Ted Olson, who was the Solicitor General at the time. You know him. He's the one that argued before the Supreme Court successfully that the election in Florida, the election recount, should be stopped, the recount that would have made Al Gore the president. That's Ted Olson. So we have him to thank for 4 and then 8 years of Bush and Cheney. Well, anyway, that morning we also have him to thank for the most famous of the phone calls from the planes. He reported that his wife, Barbara Olson, many of you remember her, well-known commentator on CNN, that she had been on Flight 77, that she had called him twice. The first phone call lasted about a minute, and the second one, 2, 3, 4 minutes, and that she reported that the hijackers had taken over the crew with knives and box cutters. The only report of all the alleged phone calls that mentioned box cutters. So this call is the one that put that in the public imagination. But when the FBI gave its report to the Moussaoui trial, it did mention Barbara Olson, but it said she attempted one call, not two, but she only attempted the call, that it was unconnected, and therefore it lasted 0 seconds. Now this is pretty amazing. The FBI is part of the Department of Justice. And so in 2006, the FBI put on a website, publicly available, that those calls from Barbara Olson to Ted Olson never happened. There were no calls from Barbara Olson. Wouldn't you think this would be front page news with screaming headlines? How many of you before tonight had heard this story? I think the mainstream press is not keeping us informed of some very important developments. So anyway, these calls, these are the main evidence that there were hijackers on the planes. And now we learn these calls didn't happen. Furthermore, besides not having evidence that these guys were on the planes, we have pretty strong evidence they weren't. First of all, a psychiatrist got, from a FOIA request, the autopsy report from the Pentagon crash. No hijacker names on the autopsy list, not a single Arab name. The airlines released the flight manifest, the passenger manifest from the 4 flights. No hijacker names on the manifest. No Arab names whatsoever. And then here's the clincher. In all these planes, there's a little transponder. And pilots are trained that if there's any sign that there's a hijacking, you punch in the universal hijacking code, 7500. Takes about 2 seconds. 4 flights, 2 pilots in each cabin, 8 pilots altogether. No one did that day. You say, well, maybe they didn't have time. According to the official story about Flight 93, it took the hijackers 30 seconds to break into the cabin. Can you really believe that these highly trained pilots would not have thought to punch in the hijack code? Okay. It looks like what we have here is a false flag attack. And these are very common by imperialist nations. They use these when there's some other nation they want to attack. They attack their own people, then plant evidence to show that the other nation did it. So Japan did this when it was ready to attack Manchuria. That started the Asian part of World War II. Hitler did it when he was ready to start to attack Poland. That started the European part of World War II. Our own Pentagon chiefs, a document called Operation Northwoods, they brought to President Kennedy shortly after Fidel Castro had taken Cuba back for the Cubans after we had controlled it for a half century. And this was labeled pretext for an invasion of Cuba. And in these pretexts were events that would kill American citizens and then blame the Cubans and use that for the basis of the attack. Now, this proposal was turned down by President Kennedy. But in 2001, the White House was occupied by an administration that wanted to attack Afghanistan and Iraq and other predominantly Muslim countries. They had 7 Muslim countries on their hit list. And so it appears evidence was planted to implicate Muslims. I turn now to the strongest evidence that the 9/11 attacks were orchestrated by insiders rather than foreign terrorists. The collapse of Building 7 of the World Trade Center, which is the subject of my most recent book, The Mysterious Collapse of World Trade Center 7, Why the Final Official Report About 9/11 is Unscientific and False. I speak of the mysterious collapse because from the very beginning, the collapse of this building was seen as the biggest mystery of 9/11. Given the fact that the Twin Towers had been hit by planes, which then started big fires because of the jet fuel, most people evidently thought it understandable, if wrongly, that these 2 buildings came down. But Building 7 was not hit by a plane, and yet it came down at 5:21 that afternoon. This would have meant, assuming that it was not deliberately demolished, that Building 7 had been brought down by fire alone, and this would have been an unprecedented occurrence. New York Times writer James Glantz wrote, "Experts said no building like it, a modern steel-reinforced high-rise, had ever collapsed because of an uncontrolled fire." Glantz then quoted a structural engineer as saying, "Within the structural engineering community, Building 7 is considered to be much more important to understand than the Twin Towers, because engineers had no answer to the question, why did 7 come down?" Moreover, although Glantz spoke of uncontrolled fire, there were significant fires on only 6 of this building's 47 floors. And these fires were visible for at most 3 or 4 hours. And yet fires have burned in other steel frame buildings for 17 and 18 hours, turning these buildings into towering infernos without causing collapse. So why did Building 7 come down? FEMA, which in 2002 put out the first official report on this building, admitted that its best hypothesis had only a low probability of occurrence, which is scientific speech for we don't have a clue. By its best hypothesis, FEMA meant that the best hypothesis it could come up with in light of the fact that it, as a government agency, could not posit the use of explosives. Now, why might anyone think that explosives had brought this building down? One reason is simply that prior to 9/11, every collapse of a steel frame high-rise building in our universe was brought about by explosives in the procedure known as controlled demolition. Collapses had never been caused by fires, earthquakes, or any other cause other than explosives. Another reason to posit explosives is that the building came straight down, collapsing into its own footprint. Now this is the part of the lecture where I most need a video. How many of you have seen Building 7 come down? So how many have not seen that? Okay, if you've not and you're skeptical, just go Google collapse of World Trade Center 7, collapse of Building 7. You'll find it. You'll see this building is perfectly stable. This is a very tall building. In half of the states in the Union, it would have been the tallest building in the state. So this should have been big news. It's sitting there perfectly stable, and then all of a sudden, it's pretty dramatic when you see it. My acting isn't quite so good. I got to work on playing Building 7. Now, for this to happen, this building was held up by 82 steel columns, these vertical columns, 82 of them. For the roof line to remain level, all 82 columns had to fail simultaneously within a split second. this cannot happen because of fire. This is what happens in the type of controlled demolition known as implosion, where the building falls in on itself. It is not something that can be caused by fires. Simply seeing the video of this building coming down makes it obvious to anyone who knows anything about these things that it was brought down by explosives. On 9/11 itself, CBS anchor Dan Rather said, "It's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen on television where a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down." In 2006, a filmmaker named asked Danny Jowinkel, the owner of a controlled demolition company in the Netherlands, to comment on a video of the collapse of Building 7 without telling him what it was. Although Jowinkel was in the field, he had never heard that a third building came down that day. After viewing the film, Jowinkel said, "They simply blew up columns, and the rest caved in afterwards. This is controlled demolition." When asked if he was certain, he replied, "Absolutely, it's been imploded. This was a hired job. A team of experts did this." An organization called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, which was formed in 2006, now has over 1,200 members. When I did an interview with Amy Goodman a few years ago, this was the crucial question. How many engineers did you have? We didn't have any. The implicit assumption seemed to be, well, if you had a bunch of engineers, we would believe you. Now we have 1,200 architects and engineers. Somehow they haven't come around. Many of the people said they joined architects and engineers when they saw the collapse of Building 7. In light of all these considerations, an investigation seeking the truth about Building 7 should have begun with a hypothesis that it too had been brought down by explosives. However, this hypothesis did not provide the starting point for NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which took over from FEMA the responsibility for writing the official report on the destruction of the World Trade Center. Rather, NIST said, with regard to Building 7, the challenge was to determine if a fire-induced floor system failure could occur in WTC 7 under an ordinary building contents fire. That was the challenge. So, although every other steel frame building that has collapsed did so because explosives were used to destroy its support columns, NIST said, in effect, we think fire brought down this one. To understand why NIST started with this hypothesis, it helps to know that it is an agency of the U.S. Commerce Department, which means that all the years that it was working on these reports, it was an agency of the Bush-Cheney administration. Also, a scientist who had worked for NIST reported that by 2001, NIST had been fully hijacked from the scientific into the political realm, so that scientists working there had lost their scientific independence and became little more than hired guns. One manifestation of NIST's political nature may be the fact that it delayed its report on Building 7 year after year after year, releasing it only late in 2008 when the Bush-Cheney administration was prepared to leave office. Be that as it may, NIST did in August of 2008 finally put out a report in the form of a draft for public comment. Announcing this draft report at a press conference, Shyam Sunder, NIST's lead investigator, said, "Our take-home message today is that the reason for the collapse of World Trade Center 7 is no longer a mystery. World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives." However, and then he said, science is really behind what we have said. However, far from being supported by good science, NIST's report repeatedly makes its case by resorting to scientific fraud. Two of the major types of scientific fraud, as defined by the National Science Foundation, are fabrication, which is the making up of results, and falsification, which means either changing or omitting data. I will begin with falsification. Claiming that it found no evidence of controlled demolition, NIST simply omitted or distorted all such evidence, some of which was testimonial. Two city officials, Barry Jennings of the Housing Authority and Michael Hess, the city's corporation counsel and Giuliani's good friend, reported that they became trapped by a massive explosion in Building 7 shortly after they arrived there at 9 a.m. NIST, however, claimed that what they called an explosion was really just the impact of debris from the collapse of the North Tower, which did not occur until 10:28. In other words, at least an hour later than what they reported. Jennings had explicitly said that they were trapped by this explosion before either of the towers had come down, which would mean before 9:59 when the South Tower came down. NIST rather obviously distorted this testimonial evidence. Other people reported that explosions went off in the late afternoon when the building finally started to come down. Reporter Peter DeMarco of the New York Daily News said, "There was a rumble. The building's top row of windows popped out. Then all the windows on the 39th floor popped out. Then the 38th floor. Pop, pop, pop was all you heard until the building sank into a rising cloud of gray." NIST dealt with such testimonies by simply ignoring them. NIST also ignored a lot of physical evidence that Building 7 was brought down by explosives. For example, 3 professors from Worcester Polytechnic Institute discovered a piece of steel from Building 7 that had melted so severely that it had holes in it, making it look like a piece of Swiss cheese. New York Times, pointing out that the fires in the building could not have been hot enough to melt the steel, called this the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. The 3 professors, in a report included as an appendix to the 2002 FEMA report, said a detailed study into the mechanism of this phenomenon is needed. When NIST's report on Building 7 appeared, however, it did not mention this mysterious piece of steel. NIST even claimed that no recovered steel from Building 7 was identified. And this was just the beginning of NIST's omission of physical evidence. The nearby Deutsche Bank building was heavily contaminated by dust when the towers came down. But the bank's insurance company refused to pay for the cleanup, claiming that the dust in the Deutsche Bank building was simply ordinary building dust, not something from the WTC event. So the bank hired the R.J. Lee Group, a scientific research organization, to do a study. And their study showed that the dust in the building was World Trade Center dust with a unique chemical signature. Part of this signature was spherical iron particles. And this meant, the R.J. Lee Group said, that iron had melted during the WTC event, producing spherical metallic particles. Iron does not melt until it reaches 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 1,000 degrees hotter than the fires in the building could have possibly been under the most optimal circumstances, which did not exist, by the way. The R.J. Lee study also found that temperatures had been reached at which lead would have undergone vaporization, meaning over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Another study was carried out by scientists at the U.S. Geological Survey, so this is a government agency. Besides also finding iron particles, these scientists found that molybdenum had been melted, even though it has an extremely high melting point, almost 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. These 2 studies prove, therefore, that something had produced temperatures many times higher than the fires could have produced. NIST, however, made no mention of these studies. But even this was not the end of its omission of physical evidence. A report by several scientists, including University of Copenhagen chemist Niels Harrit, showed that the World Trade Center dust contained unreacted nanothermite. Whereas ordinary thermite has been around for over a century and is an incendiary, nanothermite is a high explosive, a very powerful high explosive. This report by Harrod and his colleagues did not appear until 2009, several months after the publication of NIST's final report. So they could not have reported about that. But NIST should have, as a matter of routine, tested the World Trade Center dust for signs of incendiaries, such as ordinary thermite, and explosives, such as nanothermite. And this is in their manuals. This is standard. And particularly when there's any sign of explosion, you must test. They didn't do it. When asked whether it did, NIST said no. When a reporter asked Michael Newman, a NIST spokesman, why not, Newman replied, because there was no evidence of that. Scratching her head, the reporter said, but how can you know there's no evidence if you don't look for it first? Newman replied, if you're looking for something that isn't there, you're wasting your time and the taxpayers' money. I'm really not making it up. Another case of fabrication is a graphic in NIST report showing that at 5 p.m. there were very big fires covering much of the north face of floor 12. They picked out 3 floors, 11, 12, and 13, and they said, these were the crucial floors. They're the ones that caused the collapse. This claim is essential to NIST's explanation as to why the building collapsed just 21 minutes later at 5:21. This raging, enormous fire. However, if you look back at NIST's 2004 report, you will find this statement. Around 4:45 p.m., a photograph showed fires on floors 7, 8, 9, and 11 near the middle of the north face. Floor 12 was burned out by this time. Other photographs even show that the 12th floor fire had virtually burned out by 4 o'clock. And yet NIST, in its final report, claims that fires were still going strong on that floor at 5 o'clock. In addition to omitting, falsifying, and fabricating evidence, NIST affirms a miracle. How many scientists in the room? In addition, you have perhaps seen the cartoon in which a physics professor has written a big proof on the board. Mathematical equation equal, therefore, mathematical equation, therefore, well. And then at one point it says, then a miracle happens. Now, this is humorous, and particularly to scientists, because in science, that's the one thing you absolutely cannot do. You cannot affirm a miracle, meaning a violation of the fundamental laws of physics. And yet that's what NIST does. I will explain. Members of the 9/11 Truth Movement had long been pointing out that Building 7 came down at the rate of a free-falling object, at least virtually so. In other words, that if you were on the top of Building 7 and you felt it start to move and that knocked a brick out of your hand and the building starts going down, you would go down at the same speed as that brick. That's what free fall is. Virtual free fall would be very close to it. In NIST's draft for public comment put out in August 2008, it denied this, saying that the time it took for the upper floors, the only floors that are visible on the video, to come down was approximately 40% longer than the computed free fall time and was consistent with physical principles. And this statement applies. Any assertion that the building did come down in free fall would not be consistent with physical principles, meaning the principles of physics, the laws of physics. Explaining why not, Shyam Sundar said, a free fall time would be the fall time of an object that has no structural components below it. The time it took for those 17 floors to disappear was roughly 40% longer than free fall. And that is not at all unusual because there was structural resistance that was provided in this particular case. all those 82 columns and all that concrete. Would offer, if you've ever fallen through a steel frame concrete building, you know it provides a little structural resistance to your body. And you had a sequence of structural failures that had to take place. This is the notion of progressive collapse. Column 81, then column 82, and then keeps going. So he says, you had a sequence of structural failures that had to take place. Everything was not instantaneous. In saying this, Sunder was presupposing NIST's rejection of controlled demolition, which could have produced a free-fall collapse by causing all 82 columns to fail simultaneously, in favor of NIST fire theory, which necessitated a theory of progressive collapse. In response, high school physics teacher, and I stress high school because this is not sophisticated physics that you cannot understand. This is like freshman or 8th grade physics. David Chandler challenged Sunder's denial of free fall, pointing out that Sunder's 40% claim contradicted a publicly visible, easily measurable quantity. And Chandler puts this on YouTube, and he slows it down, and so you can watch him measuring it. Chandler then placed this video on the internet showing that by measuring this publicly visible quantity, anyone knowing elementary physics could see that for about 2.5 seconds, the acceleration of the building is indistinguishable from free fall. In this final report, which came out in November, NIST admitted free fall. Amazing, but it did it. Dividing the building's descent into 3 stages, NIST described the second phase as a free fall descent over approximately 8 stories at gravitational acceleration for approximately 2.25 seconds. So its only quibble with Chandler was 2.25 seconds, not 2.5. Trivial. And gravitational acceleration is just a synonym for free fall. I mean, it's coming down at the rate that gravity pulls something down with the acceleration of gravity. So after presenting over 600 pages of descriptions, testimonies, photographs, graphs, analyses, explanations, and mathematical formula, NIST says, in effect, then a miracle happens. Why would this be a miracle was explained by Chandler, who said, free fall can only be achieved if there is 0 resistance to the motion. Because if there's any resistance, the stuff coming down the top floor uses some of its energy to push the stuff out of the way. And so it couldn't come down in free fall. So you can only have free fall with 0 resistance. In other words, the top floor of the building could come down in free fall only if all the support in the lower 46 floors, all that steel, all that concrete, had been removed simultaneously. And that could only happen with explosives. If everything had not been removed and the upper floors had come down in free fall anyway, even for only a second or 2, even for only a half a second, a miracle, meaning a violation of the laws of physics, would have occurred. That was what Sunder himself had explained the previous August, saying that a free-falling object would be one that has no structural components below it to offer resistance. But then in November, while still defending the fire theory, NIST admitted that as an empirical fact, free fall happened. For a period of 2.25 seconds, NIST admitted the descent of World Trade Center 7 was characterized by gravitational acceleration free fall. Knowing that it had thereby affirmed a miracle, NIST no longer claimed that its analysis was consistent with the laws of physics. In its August draft, in which it said the collapse occurred 40% slower than free fall, NIST had repeatedly said that its analysis was consistent with physical principles. One encountered this phrase time and time again. In the final report, however, every instance of this phrase was removed. NIST thereby almost explicitly admitted that its report on World Trade Center 7 by admitting free fall while continuing to deny that explosives were used is not consistent with the laws of physics. The science of World Trade Center 7 is therefore settled. This fact is reflected in the agreement of many hundreds of professionals with various forms of expertise: architects and engineers, firefighters, physicists, and chemists, that this building was brought down by explosives. This truth has also been recently recognized by a symposium in one of our leading social science journals, American Behavioral Scientist, which this symposium treats 9/11 as an example of what its authors called SCADs, State Crimes Against Democracy. State crimes. Criticizing the majority of the academic world for its blithe dismissal of more than one law of thermodynamics that is violated by the official theory of the World Trade Center collapses, these authors also criticize the Academy for its failure to protest when Professor Stephen Jones found himself forced out of a tenured position for merely reminding the world that physical laws, about which there is no dissent whatsoever, their italics, contradict the official story. Now, normally, if a professor with a tenure position gets removed from his job, the AAUP, American Association of University Professors, protests, big protests. Not hardly a peep here. Even though, as this